The tremors now spreading across the Cascadia Fault are completely silent. No one standing above them felt a thing, and yet they are the clearest sign we have that the lower reaches of the most dangerous fault in North America are on the move along its entire length. That fault last broke in the year 1700, and it has been building ever since. Tonight, it is doing the one thing that loads it toward the next great earthquake. Last night, an automated seismic monitor watching the Cascadia Subduction zone counted 307 separate tremor signals along the fault. That number, by itself, would not stop anyone in their tracks. What stopped the people watching was where those signals appeared. They did not cluster in one spot the way this kind of activity almost always does. They ran the entire length of the fault, from the far northern end near Vancouver Island, down to the far southern end offshore Northern California, with every segment in between lighting up at once. That is the detail that matters, so hold on to it. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is a roughly 1,000-kilometer fault that sits just off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, running from Northern California, past Oregon and Washington, up into British Columbia. It is the fault that produced a magnitude 9.0 earthquake in the year 1700, and it has been silent ever since. When scientists tell you which fault in North America is capable of the single largest natural disaster this continent has ever faced, this is the one they name. And last night, along its whole length, the tracker registering its faintest movements went from mostly quiet to lit up end to end. Layered on top of that signal was one small earthquake. A magnitude 2.6 struck the southern end of the zone offshore Northern California at a point about 16 miles below the seafloor, which is roughly 26 kilometers down. On any ordinary day, a magnitude 2.6 is a non-event. It is far too small to feel, far too small to make the news. The kind of tremor the Earth produces thousands of times a week, but this one did not happen on an ordinary fault, an ordinary night. It happened at the base of the most dangerous fault on the continent, in the same window that the whole margin flickered to life. And its location tells you something the magnitude does not. 16 miles down places that little earthquake well below the shallow crustal faults that everyone in the region knows by name. Faults like the Little Salmon Zone that break near the surface. It puts it down on the plate interface itself, in the lower reaches of the boundary, where one slab of the Earth's crust grinds beneath another. That is exactly the zone where a specific and important process unfolds. And that process is the real subject of tonight's story. So, before we go any further, you need to understand what that tremor actually is, because it is nothing like the earthquakes you are used to hearing about. Tremor is not an earthquake in the way you normally picture one. A normal earthquake is a sudden, violent release. The ground snaps, energy radiates out in a few seconds, and you feel it as shaking. Tremor is the opposite of sudden. It is a faint, drawn-out, continuous seismic hum, a chatter that can last for days or even weeks, so weak that no human being standing on the ground above it would ever notice. You cannot feel it. You would not know it was happening. The only reason we know it happens at all is that we built instruments specifically sensitive enough to hear it. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network runs those instruments, and it maintains a public tremor map that catalogs every one of these faint signals as it appears. This is worth stressing because it cuts against one of the first reactions people have to a story like this. There is no secret here. The map is open. Anyone can look at it. When 307 tremor points showed up along the margin last night, they showed up on a page that the public can view, tracked by a network whose entire purpose is to watch this fault breathe. Now, why does tremor happen down where that little earthquake struck, and not up near the surface? The answer comes down to temperature and pressure. Near the surface, the fault is cold, and it is locked. The two plates are stuck fast against each other, jammed together, storing up strain year after year like a spring being wound tighter and tighter. That lock patch is where the great earthquakes actually begin. But farther down, closer to 16 miles below the seafloor, the rock is hotter and behaves differently. Down there, the plates do not lock and snap. They creep. They slide past each other slowly and quietly. And that slow sliding is what produces the tremor we can measure. That distinction is the whole game. So, let me put it plainly. The part of the fault that makes the tremor is not the part of the fault that makes the disaster. The tremor comes from the lower zone, where the fault slips gently and silently. The magnitude 9 comes from the upper zone, where the fault is locked and building toward a sudden break. They are two different regions of the same fault, one whispering, one holding its breath. And last night, the whispering region got loud along its entire length. The structural logic of the system points directly to the southern end of the margin, ocean, where the freshest activity showed up. This raises the critical architectural question: what does it mean for the entire stability of the continent when the deep engine of the fault begins a margin-wide redistribution of load? And how close is the upper lock zone to its absolute structural limit? To diagnose what this margin-wide signature means for the upper lock zone, we must analyze the specific physical mechanism that drives it. Geophysics has a precise name for this operational cycle: episodic tremor and slip. Discovered within the last 25 years, this process represents a fundamental shift in how we calculate the energy budget of subduction zones. The lower fault interface does not remain static. Instead, on a highly structured timeline, it undergoes a period of slow, silent displacement. Over the course of a week or two, this deep boundary releases a volume of stored energy equivalent to a major crustal earthquake. However, because that energy expenditure is distributed across hundreds of hours rather than a few explosive seconds, there is zero perceptible ground displacement at the surface. The continuous, low-frequency hum recorded by the instruments is the structural signature of this slow movement. Where the tremor manifests, the deep interface is actively sliding. This mechanical behavior does not follow a uniform clock across the system. In the northern reaches under Washington and Vancouver Island, these discharge cycles occur roughly every 14 months. Moving south into central Oregon, the structural resistance alters the interval, stretching it to approximately 22 months. At the far southern margin, the intervals compress, repeating on a much faster rhythm, for reasons the system physics cannot yet fully define. When the tracking network registers simultaneous displacement across the entire 1,000 kilometers boundary, it signals that the lower fault has initiated a coordinated, margin-wide slip event. This brings us to the core structural contradiction that defines the immediate hazard. The slow displacement of the lower plate boundary does not bleed off the total energy of the system, it redirects it. As the deeper, hotter rock slides smoothly, it acts as a massive mechanical wedge. Every millimeter of silent movement in the deep crust transfers its corresponding structural load directly upward into the cold, lock zone above it. It behaves exactly like a mechanical hand, applying additional pressure to a high-tension spring that is already compressed to near capacity. This is the peer-reviewed reality of the earthquake cycle. These deep slip episodes are the literal loading mechanism that drives the upper fault toward mechanical failure. Consequently, during a major slip sequence, the calculated mathematical probability of triggering a magnitude 9 rupture ticks upward, above the normal background baseline. It is vital to measure this elevation precisely, to avoid superficial panic. The statistical increase is real, yet it remains small. The overwhelming historical baseline shows that the vast majority of these slip episodes run their course and fade out without initiating a macro failure. This is why public safety agencies routinely issue low-key technical updates rather than active evacuation orders during these cycles. They are acknowledging a temporary, measurable increase in the structural load of the fault. The system is performing the exact mechanical function that primes it for failure, and it is executing that function simultaneously from end to end. The profound anxiety surrounding this signal stems directly from what the lock zone is being loaded toward. To calculate the stakes, the analytical timeline must look back 326 years to the last systemic collapse. On the evening of January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 p.m. local time, the structural limits of the entire Cascadia Subduction zone were exceeded simultaneously. The resulting megathrust rupture generated an estimated magnitude between 8.7 and 9.2, with the primary model landing at 9.0. The physical displacement tore through 1,000 to 1,100 kilometers of the fault margin. In a matter of minutes, the two distinct tectonic slabs lurched past each other by an average of 19 meters. For physical scale, that is a sudden, violent displacement exceeding the height of a 5-story building released along the entire coastline of the Pacific Northwest. A structural failure of this magnitude shatters all standard calendar expectations, sustaining violent ground motion for several minutes rather than seconds, which is long enough to destabilize structures across an entire geographic region. Because the primary fault trace sits offshore beneath the oceanic crust, this vertical displacement violently shoved the seafloor upward, displacing the water column and launching a transoceanic tsunami that would provide the definitive timeline for modern geophysics. The displacement of the ocean floor in the year 1700 initiated a kinetic chain reaction that crossed the entire Pacific Basin. Approximately 9 to 10 hours after the primary fault failure, the resulting tsunami reached the coast of Honshu, Japan. Because no European or American instruments existed along the Pacific Northwest coast at that time, the historical validation of this event relied entirely on the meticulous documentation of Japanese villages and temples. They recorded a destructive, sudden surge of seawater that flooded coastal coastal communities, without any local earthquake to precede it. For 3 centuries, this phenomenon was catalogued as an orphan tsunami, a massive wave lacking a local seismic parent. The physical origin of that wave was definitively matched 300 years later to the structural collapse of Cascadia. On the North American continent, the physical scars of this event were permanently etched into the landscape itself. As the subducting plate slipped, the sudden drop in coastal land elevation allowed saltwater to flood low-lying ecosystems, instantly drowning vast stands of coastal forest. These drowned ecosystems left behind what geologists designate as ghost forests, gray, skeletal remains of red cedar, and Sitka spruce rooted in tidal marshes. By applying dendrochronology to count the growth rings of these preserved trees, scientists match their exact final year of biological life against the precise arrival times logged in the Japanese wave records. When cross-referenced with the independent oral histories of First Nations and indigenous tribes spanning from Vancouver Island down to Northern California, researchers reconstructed the exact chronological anchor of the disaster. January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 p.m. This historical reconstruction strips away any abstract comfort. The hazard is not a theoretical model, it is a documented physical reality, with an established magnitude, an ocean-wide geological footprint, and a visible structural scar. The paleoseismic record extends far beyond this single event, providing the statistical baseline required to evaluate the current tremor activity. By analyzing structural layers within seafloor sediments and coastal marshes, geophysicists have identified approximately 19 major megathrust earthquakes over the last 6,500 years. These 19 distinct events yield the recurrence intervals that make last night's margin-wide tremor highly significant. While a full margin rupture occurs on average every 500 years, the historical data reveals that the spacing is highly irregular, ranging from a few centuries to a millennium. More critically, the data demonstrates that the southern segment operates on a much shorter fuse, breaking independently every 200 to 300 years. The arithmetic of the system is unyielding. It has been 326 years since the 1700 event. The southern stretch is now fully past its historical statistical average and closing steadily on the median interval for a full margin failure. This creates a direct connection between the current tracking data and the threat of macro failure. The tremor represents the active loading mechanism, and the event of 1700 is the precise scale of what the system is loading toward. Geophysicists have calculated the specific probability metrics for the coming decades. Within the next 50 years, the mathematical odds of a full margin magnitude 9 rupture stand at roughly 10 to 15%. The probability of a partial rupture confined to the southern segment, a magnitude 8 or greater event, is substantially higher, ranging from 30% to as high as 37% when accounting for localized stress variations. A 1 in 10 chance of experiencing the single most destructive natural disaster in the modern history of the continent within the lifetime of a person alive today represents a critical structural liability. Yet, it is essential to analyze what these data points do not mean. They define a probability window across 5 decades. They cannot forecast a specific calendar date. This systemic uncertainty is the defining feature of the Cascadia fault zone. The fundamental gap between identifying an active structural load and calculating an exact countdown is the defining friction of living above the Cascadia subduction zone. The margin-wide surge of 307 tremor points does not close this information gap. It cannot be mathematically converted into a specific calendar warning. Instead, it serves as real-time physical confirmation that the loading engine is fully engaged along the entire length of the system. This reality dictates that the only scientifically valid posture is constant systemic vigilance, without ungrounded panic. The deep tremor originates in a zone that is mechanically decoupled in its immediate timing from the locked upper zone responsible for the catastrophic rupture. A simultaneous end-to-end flare-up is a documented operational characteristic of this fault system that has occurred before and will occur again, almost always concluding with a quiet return to baseline conditions. The correct diagnostic reading of the current state is not that a megathrust failure is imminent, but that the mechanical apparatus is active. The southern fuse is stretched past its historical average, and the engine transferring load into the lock zone is in active motion. Beyond the margin-wide tremor, a highly anomalous structural disruption is unfolding at the extreme northern terminal of the system, off Vancouver Island, where the subducting ocean plate is undergoing internal fragmentation. Advanced seismic imaging published recently revealed that the oceanic slab diving beneath the North American plate is not descending as a single uniform sheet. It is physically tearing itself apart, piece by piece, resembling a slow-motion mechanical derailment rather than a smooth tectonic transition. This fragment, known as the explorer plate, is literally ripping open under extreme stress. The physical metrics of this deep tear are immense. Off the coast of British Columbia, a structural fracture runs approximately 35 kilometers long and cuts roughly 5 kilometers straight down through solid rock, and the crack continues to expand. This represents a segment of the oceanic crust that is split nearly all the way through its structural profile. This is an active modern mechanical failure. Multiple earthquakes reaching magnitudes of 6 and greater have ruptured along this exact tear within the last 2 decades alone, proving that the fracture is live. Over a long-term geochronological scale, models indicate the explorer plate will fully detach within roughly 1 million years, which will effectively shorten the active subduction zone by about 75 kilometers, or 1/12 of its current operating length. It is critical to deconstruct the public misinterpretations surrounding this northern tear. The fragmentation does not accelerate the near-term megathrust hazard, nor does it mitigate it. The structural failure is localized at the northernmost boundary on a million-year timeline, altering the geometric properties of that specific zone. It does not alter or drain the stored elastic strain sitting along the primary locked length of the margin off Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, where the actual catastrophe originates. A tearing plate at one isolated corner cannot bleed off the systemic pressure of the rest of the fault. It simply proves the subduction complex is far more structurally intricate than a textbook model, and it explains why the northern end exhibited slightly different signal trades during the recent surge. When evaluating the total system, scientists are balancing 2 distinct operational risks. On one side is the high-consequence scenario that dominates public consciousness, a full margin magnitude 9 rupture, a direct repeat of the 1700 event, generating minutes of severe ground motion, followed by a destructive tsunami striking the coast in as little as 15 to 20 minutes. This full collapse represents the single largest modern disaster liability for the continent, with a 50-year probability sitting between 10 and 15%. On the other side is a more statistically probable scenario. In any given time frame, a partial rupture restricted to the southern third of the fault, a magnitude 8 or larger event confined to the southern segment would still cause massive local destruction and a severe tsunami along the southern Oregon and northern California coastlines, but without triggering the full end-to-end system failure. Its 50-year probability is significantly higher, calculated at approximately 30%. The recent observation that a southern partial rupture represents the more immediate threat is not an intuitive guess. It aligns precisely with the physical data, showing the southern end is farthest past its recurrence clock and showed the freshest deep activity. The hard operational truth of Cascadia is that the system provides no felt signals before a total failure. The tremor remains completely silent to human senses, the slow slip cannot be transformed into a predictive forecast, and when the lock zone finally breaches its absolute limit, there will be no countdown, only the immediate onset of the shaking. The immediate operational question over the coming days is whether last night's margin-wide flare-up marks the formal initiation of a prolonged slow slip event. If the system has entered a defined episodic tremor and slip cycle, the tracking instruments at the southern end will continue to record sustained activity, filling in data points over the next week or two as the deep interface slowly moves through its displacement window. Seismologists will closely monitor the public tremor map to determine whether the southern segment, with its compressed recurrence interval, remains actively engaged, or whether the entire margin quietly shifts back to background baseline conditions. Either outcome is fully consistent with the structural mechanics of the fault, and both represent ordinary operational phases of the subduction zone. The secondary point of diagnostic analysis centers on the solitary magnitude 2.6 earthquake recorded at the southern boundary. The technical task is to observe whether this event remains completely isolated, representing a minor, localized stress adjustment within a slipping zone, or whether it marks the leading edge of a progressive sequence of deep crustal ruptures along the plate interface. A developing cluster of small stress quakes at that specific 26-kilometer depth would confirm that the slow slip is actively redistributing a high concentration of structural load into the segment that presents the highest statistical risk. Conversely, a single quiet tremor that fails to repeat would demonstrate that the fault was merely executing a standard, localized release of background strain. Within the next several days, the physical behavior of the fault system will provide the definitive answer, registering its data directly onto the open network that exposed the initial margin-wide surge. The operational structure of this observation network is entirely transparent. There is no privileged information channel, no hidden metric, and no early warning system reserved for institutional access. Every analyst and civilian watching the public tracker views the exact same system behavior simultaneously, which underscores why an objective, science-based interpretation of these seismic signals is so vital. What the system will not provide is a definitive precursory warning. This is the unyielding boundary that the Cascadia Fault forces both scientists and the population to accept. The deep tremor remains completely imperceptible to human physical senses. The slow slip cannot be mathematically modeled into a short-term temporal forecast. And the last time the plate boundary suffered a total mechanical collapse, the only surviving evidence on the far side of the Pacific was a parentless wave whose source remained undetected for 3 centuries. Consequently, when residents of the Pacific Northwest are instructed to secure alternative water infrastructure, stockpile survival supplies, establish emergency communication plans, and precisely map their geographic proximity to designated tsunami inundation zones, that protocol is not a reaction to last night's localized tremor surge. It is a necessary adaptation to the permanent geological reality that this plate boundary will inevitably breach its structural limits, that the loading process is an active and continuous mechanical certainty, and that when the upper locked zone finally fails, there will be no countdown sequence. The margin-wide tremor